Welcome to Your Bird Story, a podcast about everyday people and their relationships and interactions with wild birds. I'm your host, Georgia Silvera Seamans. Hi, listeners. Welcome back. Today, I'm talking with Ryan Goldberg about his new book titled Bird City: Adventures in New York's Urban Wilds. Ryan, please introduce yourself to listeners.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ryan Goldberg. I am an independent journalist who lives in Brooklyn, New York, and I am the author of Bird City: Adventures in New York's Urban Wilds, and a birder for 10 years now.
Thanks, Ryan. I purchased this book for a class I was teaching in the spring, which was about observing wildlife in New York City. And the book actually arrived towards the end of the course, so I didn't get to share it with students, but that's okay. I read it straight through and reread parts of it again for this conversation. I'm really excited about the book, so it's really great to be talking to you. That's my first question and it's really about how the book is organized as a series of seasonal stories, which totally makes sense because that's how many people experience nature in New York City by the seasons. But I'm curious about why you started with winter, since that's not necessarily the season most people associate with birds.
That was one of probably a few reasons, I think, maybe why I wanted to start with winter. And the place that I started the book was Breezy Point in the wintertime. Breezy Point is this sort of wild stretch of expansive beach at the western end of the Rockaway Peninsula, this long barrier beach. And it is like one of the last places that people would maybe imagine exists in New York City. And I think the book is really structured around events over the course of about a year, a little more than a year, but largely 2023. But the opening scene of the book comes a few years before that. From the minute that I experienced it, and it was going out with sort of someone who was a bit of my birding mentor in New York City, a man named Peter Dorish. And Peter is one of the sort of central figures of the book. I joined him for a waterfowl count. This waterfowl count that he does at Breezy Point, sometimes sub-zero temperatures and high winds. He had done this count for 30 plus years. And in my early years as a birder, he invited me to join him on this count. And it was a day where in my own birding life kind of lives in infamy. I guess I can ruin it for listeners who haven't read the book, but I was so seduced by this rare duck we saw called a king eider that I decided to climb up onto this rock jetty, which is, at the very end of Breezy Point, to get a better look of this king eider. And I slipped and fell. And it was a moment in my life where I thought, what has gotten into me that I've become sort of already this kind of obsessed birder that's willing to put life and limb at risk to see a rare duck down from the Arctic. And this event, to me, kind of was a great way to start the book. I always wanted to because it really introduced Peter, who was somewhat of a sort of maybe a moral compass throughout the book, and also as a way to introduce this wildness that exists in New York, and also this kind of obsession that exists among many people in New York whose lives revolve around birds, both bird conservation and counting birds and seeing birds in the city.
Can you describe the duck, the king eider? I recall that you compared the duck to something that New Yorkers are familiar with seeing.
I think it was like a Fisher-Price toy, like a sort of flattened down Fisher-Price toy. The king eider has such a unique combination of colors in its head. It's like this baby blue. There's maybe like a lime green. Its bill is definitely flattened. The bird is black on the back with these meringue-like peaks, like little sails that come out the back. And I was so swept up by it because Peter had never seen a adult male king eider on this waterfowl count that he had been doing for 30 years. So, he encouraged me to follow this bird. And I took that very literally, climbing up onto these wet rocks to try to get a better view of it.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose you're not the first person who has sort of put themselves in compromising positions to see a really fabulous bird.
Yeah, I really asked myself what had gotten into me. And I think that question is sort of what framed the start of the book was, what had gone into me. And at the same time, what gets into people and the people that I would be writing about in the book, because the stories in the book are very much driven by the people,
Mm,
who are seeing birds, who are documenting and studying birds in this megalopolis, what is changed in them to get them
mm.
to kind of see this city, the urban fabric in a way that is really different from the way that most people view New York City.
So let's talk about these people. So you mentioned Peter, who you start and end the book with, I believe, but you've come across folks who've been instrumental in starting various conservation initiatives or who have worked for conservation organizations for decades. And I'm just curious, what lessons did you learn about birding from these individuals? And what insights did you gain into who are folks who become sort of like the fabric of bird conservation in New York City, but maybe just more generally in cities?
I think I was so taken by maybe first off the determination and commitment of the people I wrote about. The book has like such a wide variety, such a great diversity of people who are working to make New York City a more hospitable place for birds. Some of the people that I write about are scientists, some are birders, some like Melissa Breyer, who is a volunteer for Project Safe Flight, which is a New York City Bird Alliance program that documents window collisions in the city. Melissa doesn't even see herself as a birder. She actually, in a kind of moment of sort of dark humor, describes herself as a dead birder because she doesn't really go birding much in New York. She's out there practically every morning around the World Trade Center buildings looking for dead and injured birds on the sidewalk. And she has that ability to identify a bird on the sidewalk from like great distances. She'd say, that's a common yellowthroat over there. And I'm like, that just looks like a speck to me on the ground or a leaf or something. So I think the determination of someone like Melissa is what really stands out for me. Birders typically like to be out there experiencing the kind of joy and the drama of migration. And somebody like Melissa sees her role as being out there to document, the dangerous side, the kind of challenges that these same birds are facing. And somebody has to do it. And she's decided, I'm going to be one of the people that will be doing that. And, there are more than 100 volunteers for Project Safe Flight now who are doing that work. I was also struck by the long-term commitment to doing the same thing like over and over and not really losing hope either. So, for instance, Peter Doris, who I mentioned, Peter has worked on the natural resources crew at the Prospect Park Alliance, Prospect Park in Brooklyn for 25 years now, and working on like managing, restoring the habitat of some of the best woodlands for birds in Brooklyn. And this is like slow work, takes a long time. And not being deterred to keep doing that type of work over years, knowing that the trees you're planting now, you may not get to see any warblers in those trees. Somebody else will. Somebody like Don Reapy, who I write about in the book, who is a legendary local naturalist and conservationist in Jamaica Bay. And Don has been working his entire life to try to restore the bay, to make it a cleaner place, to maintain the islands that wading birds nest on there, lots of things like this. So ecologists that work in the Bronx River who are doing the really hard work of like removing sewage from the river and restoring the habitat along its banks. And so I guess the lessons are like the work that people are doing, you really have to commit to it and you have to continue with it, sometimes really frustratingly not seeing results for a long time.
The quote that you mentioned from Melissa about her perception of her role as being a dead birder, I think I almost cried at that point because it is really, you get really emotional when you come across a bird who's died from striking a glass window, which is maybe 99% avoidable at this time because of the technology that we have. And to think of these creatures who have flown any kind of distance to get here and then to die in this way. And then you have more sort of light stories like the work that Peter is doing and that Don's doing. And then you also write about Chris Alieri for the New York City Plover Project, which I feel like is kind of a mix of all of the work that these other folks are doing and all of the emotional valence that comes with this kind of work. Like it's really great to see these cute little birds on the beach, but then there are some really challenging aspects to their conservation as well. So, going back to the organization of the book and by season and starting with winter, for each season, you focus on a person, a place, a group of species. What decisions did you make about who, what, when to put in each season? There's just like a really beautiful flow to it. If folks outside of New York City are reading this book, this is what it feels like to be a birder in New York City.
It's really nice to hear you say that. And I think I did want it to reflect what it is like to be a birder in New York City. As a birder myself, since 2016, one thing that I learned very quickly is that birds really, especially, well, I was going to say migrating birds, but birds are always migrating through New York, really, in all seasons, in all times of year. But birds like order our lives here, and they create our own calendars based around, when birds are arriving, when they're departing. And that has been one of the most wonderful aspects to me of birding in New York, is that it has plugged me into the seasons here in a way that I didn't feel that connection to the world before, to nature and its rhythms. So I wanted the book to reflect that. And so as I set out to structure the book, before I started doing my reporting, I knew, for instance, that I wanted to have a chapter about the kind of waves of migration in the spring, capturing a wave day, a day where birds are rolling through the city parks. And it's a thing that is memorable. Like even me thinking about it now, like the kind of hair goes up on my arms to be at a place like Central Park or Prospect Park, early in the morning for the dawn chorus as waves of warblers are arriving, on a May morning. So there were things like that I felt like are always existing. They would exist in any year, and that I would be able to have those experiences in the book. At the same time, as a lifelong reporter, I also knew that there were people and places that I wanted to write about that I didn't actually know that much about yet. For instance, like the Bronx River. You mentioned the New York City Plover Project. That was a group that I wanted to follow for a summer and for a chapter of the book, to be able to write about the people that are part of this group and what they're doing. So I was sort of targeted with the places that I wanted to go and the people I wanted to meet and write about, but at the same time, layering that on top of these kind of timeless experiences that all birders sort of know and experience living in New York. And I also wanted to be able to include every borough in New York. There have been some great birding books about New York over the years, and I almost don't think of my book as a birding book because it's so much about the people and it's so much about the place. But many books often have been centered at Central Park or maybe in Manhattan. And so I wanted all the boroughs to be reflected in here. And I also wanted to be open to events that might happen that I could go out and just write about, so that there was also a timeliness to what I was writing about. And one example of that is I always was going to have a chapter on owl ethics because it's something I feel quite strongly about. And it is something that certainly many birders in New York are aware of. There being a lot of maybe conflict between certain owl viewing etiquette and ethics in different boroughs. Manhattan, for instance, is very different from Brooklyn. And so when Flacco escaped from the Central Park Zoo. At first, I didn't go up to see this and what happened, but then it became like clear to me that this was an important story that fit into this chapter I was already working on. So there was a lot of different, layers to what I wanted to write about. Just sort of lastly, each section of the book, each season, at least when I started my research, I saw a theme for each season. And so that also helped me kind of order the material that was going to be in each section of the book. For instance, the first section of the book, Winter, I really saw as like a kind of the theme was sort of adaptation. And so there's stories in there about peregrine falcons adapting to the urban environment, European starlings, and which were introduced to New York and their level of adaptation here. So, the last chapter of the book in my mind was all about sort of chance. The last chapter of the book is all about vagrant birds that end up here that aren't meant to be here, or at least aren't expected. So each section did have a theme, and maybe it got a little looser as I was like working, but that is sort of how, at least in the beginning, it helped me to structure the book.
Well, I really appreciate that. And now that you've said it, I mean, and I read the book all the way through, I didn't think about this consciously, but yeah, all the boroughs are represented. Staten Island, Brooklyn, Bronx, Manhattan, Queens. It's really quite amazing. And you are right. There has in the past been a kind of Manhattan-centric focus when it comes to birding. A couple of questions out of what you just said. Can you briefly say who Flacco was?
Flacco was a Eurasian eagle owl that had lived his entire life in captivity, more or less at the Central Park Zoo. He hatched to parents that were also in captivity in like a North Carolina sort of park or zoo. Flacco was sent to the Central Park Zoo and lived there, I believe, for 13 or 14 years. And in the early part of 2023, his enclosure at the zoo was vandalized and he was able to fly out of the zoo. And he lived more or less in Central Park for the next 14 months. He learned how to feed himself, to hunt for the first time in his life. Early on, the Central Park Zoo staff tried to recapture him and they were unable to do so. And then he lived in the wild for the next 14 months until he died. He collided with a building, but he was basically a kind of poisoned owl from the rodents that he was eating and also the sort of pigeons that he was eating later in his life. And Flacco completely captivated the city. When he died, I believe he had an A1 obituary in the New York Times. I mean, it was international news that this apex predator, a Eurasian eagle owl, was able to survive on his own. And so many people were visiting him daily. His whereabouts were published daily, on Twitter and whatnot. And everyone knew his story and they found like the way that you maybe see wildness in the city, like how you view that, like would reflect how you viewed Flacco. Like people found different interpretations and meaning and inspiration or hope from his story of surviving in the wild and being a free animal as opposed to being one that had lived his life behind bars.
Yeah, and hearing you talk about Flacco in this way reminds me of an insight from the book where you look at people's relationships to an individual bird versus people's relationship to birds in groups, whether that's a flock or some other bird collective noun. And Central Park is also sort of the origin story for the European starling in New York City and in the US. So I'm curious if you could sort of talk about that distinction that we as humans make between how we can come to love an individual bird, but have less close ties to birds that are part of our group.
Yeah, I think one thing that it may speak to is maybe a kind of rugged individualism, this myth of the individual that's baked into American life, that crowds are something to be feared, whereas the individual is like maybe a representation of all of our dreams and ruggedness and freedom. And I do think that on a sort of maybe more basic level, individual birds, especially in New York, especially birds of prey, because they're bigger, they're more easily viewed, have been a kind of gateway into loving nature and loving nature in New York's. There have been these like kind of celebrity birds, of which Flaco became the latest. There were birds that had followings in New York. One of the earliest was a red-tailed hawk named Pale Mail that, most New York City birders, certainly of a certain age, would know about. This was the first red-tailed hawk that apparently nested on a building, and it was on Fifth Avenue across from Central Park on a sort of luxury co-op building. And people follow Pale Mail, his various mates, his offspring for many, many years from the 90s on. There was like a mandarin duck that was released into the pool at Central Park. And this was a bird known as the hot duck that people followed. So I do think like having an individual bird that people can like follow and become kind of captivated by is often a way that people become into birding. So you mentioned even with the Plover Project, there was a bird that had been banded as a chick in New Jersey and then tried nesting at Fort Tilden in the Rockaways for a number of years. This bird had been named by the wildlife officials that banded it Clark Kent. And this bird kept returning. And for the New York City Plover Project people, Clark Kent became this like ambassador for them, and also this representation of all the challenges that piping plovers were facing on these very crowded beaches, crowded with people, as these birds were trying to find a little bit of room to nest. Whereas like a bird like a starling, being a flock bird, birds that are in flocks, you can't find that individual that you could maybe follow year after year. The birds are not returning to the same place. It was funny because that only kind of came out to me as I was sort of writing this particular chapter, when I thought about a bird like a starling that is often so reviled by birders, and this is an introduced bird, but what was it about them, and what was it about, say, peregrine falcons, which is another bird that was introduced to New York City? So these species were both introduced here. Why was one more beloved and seen as like a kind of symbol of wildness than one that sort of had a sort of similar introduction?
It's really fascinating. I'm more of a tree person than a bird person. And I think about trees that people build relationships with, and they're often individuals, especially in an urban context. I think of the New York City Parks Department's Great Trees program and how it sort of, in a way, is kind of the arboreal analog to these bird ambassadors. You mentioned that you sort of entered this world in 2016. Was there a singular experience?
There was. The first time I ever went birding was with my aunt in New Jersey, quite close to where I grew up in Monmouth County. And my aunt was a birder, and she, asked me if I wanted to go out. And I think I was a little predisposed to it. Like I had asked her maybe a year or two prior. I told her I'd be interested in going sometime, and she gave me a pair of binoculars and a field guide, but they just sat in my closet collecting dust for a year or two. But I needed more of a push. And when I was visiting my aunt, she asked me if I wanted to go out to this park that I had passed thousands of times as a kid growing up. And behind like these athletic fields was like this kind of forest, a small forest with a little tiny creek going through it. And there was just something that day about seeing a place differently than how I had seen it before. And it was birds that brought me there. And it wasn't like a very birdy day. It was early April, and there were very few birds around at that time. But I remember we were trying to figure out whether the little falcon we saw up on a dead tree was a kestrel or a merlin. And my aunt pulled out her field guide, and just flipping through the field guide as well was like a really enchanting experience for me. It was like I couldn't believe that there were this many birds that you could see. And my curiosity was really sparked by that. And, I went out again. And then really when I was really hooked for good was the very first walk that I went on with the Brooklyn Bird Club, which was the first week of May in 2016, a few weeks after this first experience I had birding with my aunt. And there was just something about the community of people that I met that day. It's funny, like people say this now when you meet like a birder and who's, experienced that like they must be an ornithologist or something by how much they know. You're like, so that day we went out in Prospect Park, and people are identifying the birds by their song, and with little flashes of color, they're able to determine if it's this warbler or that warbler. And I just thought these people are like so brilliant. Like, how can anyone ever know this? But everyone there was so welcoming that day. And I guess I just had this feeling, and the Brooklyn Bird Club has been around since 1909, and I was joining their walk. And it felt to me like I was being included in this, like a New York City tradition. Like it was sort of like this great old group with so many passionate, enthusiastic, and intelligent people. I felt like I was being introduced to like a new world in New York. And as a reporter and someone who has always been driven by a curiosity to learn more, I was like really, I was just really sold at that moment.
Mm. Since you've been to all the boroughs and you've talked to so many individuals who are both instrumental but just sort of everyday people enjoying birds in New York City, what would you recommend to a New Yorker who's curious but doesn't really know where or how to start?
I would probably suggest like looking to see of the many clubs that exist in New York that offer bird outings. I would probably suggest just going on one. I'm a member of the Brooklyn Bird Club. I help to lead walks for the club, well, all year, but especially during spring and fall. And the club does an introduction to bird watching every Saturday in Prospect Park. Binoculars are provided, so you don't have to, come in with your own pair. And I just think it's a wonderful way to learn and to see if you think you might like it. It's a great group of leaders. Many of them are my friends, and they're just sharing their knowledge and their passion for this, both for birds, but the place as well, especially in New York, where so little of our environment is actually kind of protected spaces for birds, but for us, we need the same things that birds need, in my opinion, to have like a healthy, positive, happy life. And so once you learn about the places and start visiting them, then you kind of feel a real attachment to them, and you want to do a lot in your power to try to conserve and protect these places. So I'm always like so happy leading bird walks in Prospect Park, for instance, and people who have lived their whole life in New York, for decades, are going to places in the park that they've never been before. And it's birds that get you to places like that. So, I would say looking for an introduction walk. New York City Bird Alliance has so many field trips, so many outings. Groups like the Feminist Bird Club, Queer Birders, other sort of borough-based groups like Queens County Bird Club. There's just so many opportunities now to get exposed to birding in New York that I think, just go check them out. And most of them are either free or low cost. I think that's a great way to do it. I also think it's like not everyone lives near like a big city park, but I think even the smallest places, even the smallest green spaces in New York can be great places to watch birds. And so I think wherever you live in the city, you're not going to be very far from a place where, especially during migration, you might can sit on a park bench and see, maybe 30 different types of birds in a given morning. As I write about in my book, some parks in the city that are less than 50 acres have like lists of over 200 species of birds. So wherever you live, birds are all around us. And once you start paying attention to them, you're going to start seeing them wherever you go.
Yeah, I'm going to give a shout out to my neighborhood park, Washington Square Park, where you can see lots of birds, especially in fall and spring migration. And sometimes you only need a tree, right? There's a section in the book where you talk about how warblers create these like feeding niches on a single tree, and people have been finding lots of vireos on the honey locusts that are growing on their block lately. And so sometimes you just need that one tree to have this really rich experience. Ryan, I'd like to close by asking you, what is your favorite biogeographical fact about New York City? You write a lot about the city's geologic history in the chapter titled Moraine. It is clear that you did a lot of sort of deep background research in addition to the ethnographic work you did talking to folks and visiting places. So I'm just really curious about this aspect of the book.
Well, I think probably my favorite thing is just how everything we see in New York is shaped by glaciers. In particular, the last glacier to reach these parts, the Wisconsin ice sheet that was like, I think 2 miles thick. So it's not even a glacier, it's more like an ice sheet. And it came this far south and then began to recede and melt like 18,000 years ago. And so I love the fact that if you are aware where your feet are landing, where you're walking in New York, you're walking on the scars of this glacier. And if you live in parts of Brooklyn, Queens, or Staten Island, you are, good chance that you're standing on what's known as the terminal moraine, which is the farthest advance of that ice sheet. And that when it began to recede, all the soil and rocks that had very slowly pushed this way, they were deposited along here. And as the ice sheet receded, all that stuff stayed behind. So we have this ridge that runs through Brooklyn, Queens, and into Staten Island that actually gives quite a bit of height to the place where you live is a coastal plain. And so, people in the rest of the country may say like, oh, we have mountains out west. Yes. But in New York, like in Brooklyn, you can stand 200 feet up if you're standing on the terminal moraine, like in Greenwood Cemetery, for instance, and you can see like to the ocean, you can see to the harbor, you can see to the mountains of New Jersey, you can see lower Manhattan. And so what I love about New York is because of the terminal moraine, all it takes is a little bit of elevation rise to have like incredible views of the city. I'll kind of finish with just on top of that, the terminal moraine rises from Brooklyn and it keeps rising into Staten Island. And there's a place in Staten Island called Toad Hill, which is about 400 feet above sea level. And Toad Hill is the highest place on the Atlantic coastal plain from Cape Cod all the way to Florida. So 400 feet again does not seem like a lot, but we're talking about a coastal plain. It should be like at sea level. And so 400 feet, gives you just these like panoramic sweeping views of this island city that we live in. New York City is an island city. Only the Bronx is on the North American continent. The rest of the city is an archipelago. So, we have such a rich ecosystem here, such diverse habitats. So much of them have been shaped by this glacial age.
Ryan, I really want to thank you. I mean, I feel like I could talk about this book for so much longer, really. Is there a local bookstore that you want to shout out where folks can pick up Bird City?
If you live in Brooklyn, my local bookstore is called The Lofty Pigeon. It's on Church Avenue in Kensington. I've done a number of events with them and they've been a big supporter of my book and their name is great. So it's a perfect fit. I would say The Lofty Pigeon. Anywhere you live in New York, if you have a local bookstore, they're probably carrying it. And if not, they can order it for you. So support your independent local bookstores.
Appreciate the time you spent with me hitting some of my favorite parts of this book.
Thank you, Georgia.
Thanks so much, Ryan. Thank you for listening to this episode of Your Bird Story. Like, review, and subscribe on your favorite podcast app. Your Bird Story is an initiative of Local Nature Lab.